So I will, this is the content of my presentation. I will start with some introductory notes in order, on Kosovo actually, in order to promote, maybe not to promote, but to provide for some participants here, but also to recall for many others that are here too, the context of cultural heritage in the cities in which we live. The second part is about the narrative and the landmarks, and I chose here to walk you through this theme through a quick profile or quick read of Pristina, along with stressing issues that characterize the city in general. Excuse me, is it okay if I turn off the camera, or should I keep the camera on? What would you prefer?
Whatever you prefer is fine. You can turn it off if you like.
Okay, in that case, and let me, okay, I'll keep it this way. And the third part illustrates some of actions undertaken in the city, as well as it brings the discussion about some possible steps that we may need to take in the future. Let me start by saying that like in every other context of heritage in any other country in the world, be it established and embraced or contested and untold, the understanding of Kosovo's cultural heritage is of vital importance for informing and guiding its protection in the city level. I will show you here some pictures from the destructions of cultural heritage during the war of 1998-1999, again, in order to recall the context of Kosovo in the verge of the new millennium. Some of the sites that you see here went through process of reconstruction, for example, the Charshia in Jakova, and rehabilitation, but much of what was burnt down to the ground from the Serbian forces have never managed to recover. Another fact that informs on the context of Kosovo's heritage is that of the missing artifacts, which were taken from the Museum of Kosovo and taken to Belgrade during 1998-1999, and are still being kept in Serbia, despite of being addressed as an issue by high-profile international political circles and documents. We will most probably hear more today on the continuous political use of Kosovo's heritage and in its contestation and interpretation along ethnic lines. But I'll continue with the third issue. The third issue, which I think needs attention when discussing the context of Kosovo, is the interpretation of the context of Kosovo itself. The so-called Kosovo issue has offered actually an intellectually intriguing and challenging case for international academics, journalists, and legal experts alike shortly, because Kosovo was put in the map of international relations due to its specificities of its transition from the autonomous province to the organization of a parallel state between 1989 and 1999, to the end of the war following the 78-day NATO campaign, bombardment campaign, and establishment of the International Protectorate, and followed with the proclamation of independence in 2008. So when narrating Kosovo, international publications usually deal with a range of problems on notions which are related to cultural heritage, such as multi-ethnicity, religions, monuments, etc. And their covers, as you can see, in a way inform that the wrapper of a story of any nature when narrating Kosovo is related to its cultural heritage, that is, monuments and its socio-political and cultural landscape. After gaining independence, Kosovo historians faced the need to revisit history and revise concepts which were shaped in a rigid and ideologically charged environment, as was the case with other European countries and nations following the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the end of the confrontation of two main ideologies, Western democracy and the Soviet-led communism. In this light, at that time, Council of Europe recommended that historians engage in such a process, but called for careful consideration of history and its interpretation based on three principles: history without propaganda, history without prejudices, and history based only on the real facts. Heritage, at the same time, is synonymous with the past, and the close linkage between heritage and the past makes heritage, like history, prone to similar form of interpretation. In order to correct this approach, especially in the Balkans, knowing that the driving force of interpretation of history remains nationalism, and knowing that usually the events and evidences are often truthful only within the context of nationalistic agenda. So that the approach in the Balkans and Kosovo has grown lately, or it is intended to grow into a tool or an instrument for the regional political stability, hoping that one day we'll reach the moment where cultural heritage also in our region will be considered as it is generally considered cultural, political, but also as an economic resource. Europeanization is the last point of my discussion on the Kosovo context. In the last two decades, Kosovo has worked in consolidating its institutional and legal framework in line with the European standards, and also received support and developed projects, again, and devised national policies and documents with European future in mind. We even promoted Kosovo's new identity through the Young Europeans campaign with youth as a centerpiece of country's legacy and future. However, while building Kosovo's identity, urban identity of cities and heritage sites has been relativized to the point of abandonment, not to say alienated for the sake of economic gain or development, so to say. Here we missed to catch the European context, because alternatives that make cities and urban heritages direct builders of national economies actually are the right opportunities for Kosovo, as they promote the plurality of values of heritage beyond cultural and its use beyond political. At this point, I descend at the city level. Cities too, like countries, have specificities, but also certain general features encountered elsewhere in the world. Depending on the place or the context, the city narrative takes much or sometimes even less from historical foundations and heritage, as is the case for Pristina, for example. Pristina is rather often narrated from its present and future perspective, while its past and heritage are not properly utilized in visioning the city, and hence its urban identity and memory came to be the fragile components at this case, risking also the loss of the sense of the belonging. An exercise, actually, this is an exercise that we usually do develop a student of architecture at the University of Pristina. What we do, you actually try to read the city. We start by identifying the past and present identity components, and I will bring you a short tour on Pristina, because as I understand from organizers, Pristina will be also the place where the site visits eventually would take place. So I think it would be maybe a little helpful for students a bit to know on how we read the city. Okay, I will start with the fact that Pristina used to be a garden city. Travelogues tell us about extensive yards and gardens, abundant vineyards, and beautiful houses. It gradually adopted the Ottoman city typology, which actually developed throughout the Balkans. It was an open city, has not inherited a medieval castle, but it is surrounded by Byzantine castles, which can be interpreted as Pristina's fortification. It was a city of rivers and fountains. The system of rivers and water dispersers coexisted in synergy with inner town gardens. Actually, Pristina had 2 rivers and 50 public fountains until late 1960s. Authorities decided that the city can do better, so they buried them and they turned the garden city into a dry city. Now, throughout history, Pristina was a seat of rulers, emperors, kings, sultans, generals. They passed by, sometimes they stayed longer. They left little behind, but they collected a lot of gold, silver, and other precious metals from wealthy settlements around the city. The streets of Pristina has always steamed from the city center, and connected the city with the neighboring wealthy settlements, which actually conditioned the transiting character of Pristina as much as its central position in the region. Well, the vicinity of Pristina actually tells us more about historical and spatial continuity of the city. The city itself is basically based, actually, what is visible is the legacy of the Ottoman town. Here in the vicinity, majority of cultural heritage sites are located, and you can see here some small maps that document the existence of historic layers from prehistory, Roman Dardania, Byzantium, medieval, and Ottoman era. So when we discuss Pristina's cultural heritage, we should think beyond present-day urban borders. Landscape approach actually would be the just approach for future urban planning production and landscape approach can also do for Kosovo as a whole, because Kosovo is a small country and the settlements are so close to each other. So I think that we should consider this also as a country as a whole. But again, there is one problem we face in this approach. Historical landscape approach needs poses as a need to plan together. So in this case, we would need to plan together with surrounding municipalities if we would wish to build a future for our past, especially in the case of Pristina. But in Kosovo, municipalities are responsible for planning for their own territories. And so far, there is no tradition put in place where two or more municipalities had worked together in a joint spatial or management plan. From the map of the municipality of Pristina shown here, we see that municipal border today does not reflect the natural, nor historical or cultural production of the city. In this scenario, it is difficult to plan the urban, as it already is at the edges of the administrative border. Therefore, a solution for Pristina remains to seek in the future the co-planning and co-management for with the municipalities in its surrounding, that it's in the vicinity. I think it's interesting to recall that municipal borders have changed in the past. So maybe we should not be that pessimistic. Maybe we can change the borders also in the future. I think that the one picture that shows the border of Pristina between 1963 and 1989 was quite well thought vis-a-vis historical and cultural production of the city. Just a remark. Okay, now let me give you a short read on city's heritage layers. This is the Ottoman Pristina. Between 15th and early 19th century, Pristina was a compact city. Over the course of 5 centuries, the city retained its urban borders while it densified within. So the density of urban density grew with time. Once there was a bazaar, the social, cultural, economic, and political nucleus of the city. Unfortunately, it was demolished in 1960s to make room for the central functions and the new political image of the capital city at the time when Kosovo was part of Yugoslavia, but a part of the old city survived. So then we have mosques, we have baths dating back to the 16th century, there are traditional houses, then the authentic street pattern have survived too. Yet, there is no conservation plan for the area. Actually, there is an open debate about where to put the borders of the conservation area, while arguing that much has been devastated. I think then the answer is in this map. And the city grew beyond the old borders during the late 19th century. The history of this period is quite complex: decentralization, desecularization, secularization, of the Ottoman Empire in general after the Tanzimat reforms. There are wars, a huge flux of migration from present-day south of Serbia, which is the former Sanjak of Niš, and we get trade deals with European countries, rail lines, we have boulevards. So all these mark the beginnings of modernization of Pristina, thus Kosovo. Pristina was at the same time, for some time, the capital of the Vilayet of Kosovo, and the administrative and military center was organized around the building of the Museum of Kosovo. There were other public buildings in the surroundings shown in those drawings in the lower bottom of the screen. Here you see many other buildings that were built at that time, but unfortunately some were destroyed again through the means of urbanism. We have then the period that we call interwar Pristina, between wars. This part of the history is hardly documented. Pristina is hardly documented. Ottomans, what we know is that the Ottomans left and the Kingdom of Serbs and Croats and Slovaks came in. Later on, the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. It was the time when vicinity regained importance. New colonies, mostly the Novo Selos, meaning new villages in Serbian, were built throughout Kosovo for the newcomers from Serbia and Montenegro. The city itself suffered war destruction and very few buildings were built. The kingdom built for itself in a royal neo-Baroque, rather eclectic style. Socialist Pristina, there are 6 themes that characterize or portray the socialist Pristina. First is erasure of the Ottoman past, which I already mentioned twice. We have the production of new plans and narratives that supported the argument for destruction of the so-called primitive Albanian culture of the past and its transformation into a splendid socialist future. Then we've got more colonies, such as Obilić, Fuškosov, Zvečan, mainly mining and industrial towns built near the mines. Then we got modernist neighborhoods, which were created in majority in free lands. Then landmarks, which are really distinct for the visionary architecture, yet the problem is that they remain quite dispersed and detached in spatial terms. And then we have planning for destruction of the historic core through the means of one conservation plan that in fact intended to demolish over 40% of the old tissue. Luckily, this plan was never implemented. Okay, to wrap up, and we come to the point that we are living now, the post-war Pristina. Actually, it is post-war Pristina. The Pristina of after 1999 is a narrative of tremendous gap between the memories of the past, the present state of heritage, and its future role in the identity building. I will show you one picture of Pristina that I have taken in 2003. Actually, this is a frozen picture of Pristina. Pristina looked the same in 1970s. So between 1970s and early 2000, the city center was the same. There was no development as was planned. Everything had stopped and halted. Development happened in other parts of the city, but not in this part, in the center. Urban blocks remained unfinished. So we have a kind of unfinished modernization in the very center of Pristina. Behind the front streets, you'll find diverse urban qualities. You even find some private land plots that date back to pre-modern times, even 17th century. 3 themes characterize the post-war period. The under construction phase. This is when the war-torn Kosovo was being rebuilt, Pristina became home to the quarter of the Kosovo population. The capital city, of course, was the idea of hope and future for many Kosovars. Later, all engaged in search for a new identity, not looking at the past, but only at the European future. It was only when the social media became popular that the citizens reclaimed the memory of the city's past. The under construction phase is an interesting part, for it shaped the near urban future and the negative city image which we suffer today. We've got now 3 sub-themes under this theme, the under construction. We've got institution building. First, there were internationals who settled in public buildings in the aftermath of the 1990s war. Then it was not enough. The demand grew for office space. Therefore, they went on and then accommodated in private buildings. As a result, when Kosovo institutions got constituted, they had no other choice but accommodating private buildings, which enlarged to the edges of the plots, of course, without seeking construction permits. Then we have a building boom, especially during the first decade of the post-war. Here, I think that there was this kind of know-how knowledge transfer from the situation I just described. And then we got the sub-theme of plans and non-plans. Sometimes you really don't see the difference between a building built with a construction permit and the one built without a construction permit. But then there are cases like in the last picture in the right corner here that they really, really shock. Well, the fate of some landmarks is also a bit shocking. The landmark problem in Kosovo is in fact more about the process than the outcome. Many buildings, majority of which are modernist landmarks, went through the process of privatization and later some demolition or alternation. This one here is the ex-Hotel Union, built in late 1920s. The building was privatized by the international company Benetton, and it actually underwent 2 successive fires caused allegedly by human factor. Now it's functional, okay, but it's a new building, it's a reconstruction. And this is the famous Grand Hotel, also privatized, and the new owner intended to beautify the facade, but the public pressure stopped it, luckily. Then cases like Factory Plastica, factories in general, are plenty. They got privatized, redeveloped into completely something different. So what we are actually suffering right now, we are losing our industrial heritage through the process of privatization and complete alienation. The buildings which were given in use to institutions are in a better shape, especially those predating ex-Yugoslavia. This is the building of the Ministry of Health. Now, with old buildings, we have another problem. We know very little about their history. There are confusing narratives which affect the overall narrative of the city. We find 2 different narratives about this, about the primary use of this building, the hospital and the school. The inherited narrative from the official monograph of the past regime identified it as a Turkish school. This fact continued, or alleged fact, continued to be reproduced and reinterpreted in all other sources since then, including oral interpretations. But then there are other sources. There is another source, the Serbian diplomat Nušić, who served in the embassy of Serbia in Kosovo at the turn of the 20th century. He has written in his book that this used to be a fine building of the military hospital. There are landmarks that lack interpretation in overall. This is the old hammam, completely covered by vegetation behind the fences of the building of the parliament, and then completely left out from the city narrative. And its value consists solely in the fact that it is a protected site. That's it. We find nothing about the picture that you see here in the black and white picture. I actually took it from the Cultural Heritage Database of Serbia. Then what do we have? We have landmarks in desperate need for reinterpretation. This is the Pristina clock tower. It replaced the old one, once located in the courtyard of the museum, and was built by order of Sultan Abdul Hamid II with the purpose of introducing the European time in the context of westernization of empire. In 1901, the Sultan commissioned over 70 clock towers to be built all over the Ottoman Empire in commemoration of the 25th anniversary of its accession to the throne. And then the story goes on. But in the database of cultural heritage, we read much about the tower's bell that was brought from Pristina, from Moldova, by the Ottoman army as a war trophy. The story of the bell that prevails the clock tower narrative is knitted by the past regime at the time of its protection, which is the case with all other monuments. But this one, like other ones too, this narrative was not corrected yet. Actually, unfortunately, this bell that we are talking about was, which survived the 100 years in the Pristina Tower, was stolen in the year 2000 by unknown thieves. And believe it or not, this is the only piece of information added to the old communist narrative. To wrap up, the bell narrative, as such, is keeping Pristina's clock tower stripped from contextual interpretation and thus from objective valorization, or let's say value assessment and presentation. Confusing narratives, lack of interpretation or vague interpretation result in the lack of valuation and value assessment in the city of Lebanon. This is one of the reasons why the officials in charge of planning and conservation have doubts still, 20 years after the war, about where to put the borders of the historic core of Pristina. I have mentioned earlier the fact that the historic core of Pristina is neither defined graphically or protected by law. I have communicated my studies on past plans and proposals, and I believe that many of us in this meeting had done the same to the officials in charge, but apparently officials in charge lack political will to deal with this important issue, to genuinely protect the area from further deterioration from illegal buildings and alike. The problems I just described have been stubborn, and the institutional response has been almost null, regardless of many actors, actions, and projects initiated by academia and civil society. Over a decade ago, some of us from the University of Pristina got together with colleagues, architects from Kosovo, Austria, Netherlands, Germany, and so forth, and we decided that we actually can get or have a crucial role to play in addressing the stressing issues in the city. And here I'm going to give you a few examples. We involved students in our research, worked on concepts, produced drawings, presented our works. We produced, among others, the manual and the regulation for legalization of illegal buildings for the municipality of Pristina, which later was taken as basis for drafting the national law. Obviously, we worked on the future of the city too. We named Pristina Dynamic City, and we identified knowledge and education as key factors for the future development of the city. In 2013, we presented our work in an exhibition. It's this picture in the corner, in the left corner, where, that you see with children learning the city through a model. We gave proposals to connect Mother Teresa Boulevard with the old part of the city. I call it the historic backbone of Pristina. And another proposal was to visually connect the youth, the university compound with the city, and again, many other good stuff that students produced during research. We at the Faculty of Architecture have started a students' magazine called Architectura Discurs Teoric. Past students' essay from the course of Theory and Criticism get published there. Some have great ideas about architecture, tradition, and the city. We got documentation of architectural heritage is another exercise we do at the faculty in regular basis. Lately, the students have developed quite a sensitivity towards cultural environment and their own role in the domain of conservation as well. Well, certainly there is much more to do ahead. I think that we can adjust our approach and attitude towards Kosovo's cultural heritage once we are clear with notions of contestations and adherence. I already mentioned before that Europeanization as a general concept became part of Kosovo's social and political discourse, and that the quest for Kosovo's new identity is framed within this anticipated European future. One interpretation of the condition of Europeanization by Peter Wagner is related to the common experience and common heritage of the member states of the European Union. In this line, cultural heritage, identity, and collective memory becomes part of the definition of Europe, based on the principles of protection and promotion of common ideals and principles of the member states. Judging from this point of view, Europeanization and European identity of Kosovo should be defined by linking the aspects of Kosovo's culture and heritage in the context of European space. I furthered the discussion on the future of heritage by urging students, but also all other stakeholders and participants in this workshop, to acknowledge the importance of theory and good practice in our daily dealing in the field of heritage. Concepts, models, lessons learned, they should become natural part of our considerations, both academia and institutional, in order for us to get further with the task we have for recontextualizing our cultural heritage in the context of contestation and the anticipated adherence. I think in Kosovo, but also in other countries, part of this workshop. I have proposed the model of commodification by Gregory Ashworth as a tool to test Kosovo's objectives against the process of heritage. Basically, his model makes the link between heritage and the city and the shaping of cities' identity through the use of heritage, including the preconditions to develop strategies to shape the European identity. After all, commodification, or the economic objective, according to Ashworth, is used in most European cities and is easier to understand and measure rather than the political one. In the case of Kosovo, pursuing the economic objective would enable its integration, meaning decontestation, as well as mitigation of the decades-long political use of heritage. This alternative also opens up perspectives for the effective planning and management of cities, urban and rural ensembles, archaeological sites, and historic landscapes in Kosovo, along with their active urban and cultural histories. In this course of work, a proper classification, if I may say proper classification of heritage assets in line with international charters and recommendations is paramount. Then further typological analysis informs us how certain monuments are endangered in terms of numbers, but also urges us to consider the protection of historic areas and cultural landscapes rather than single monuments, which basically prevails in the case of Kosovo. One excellent, tool that can be utilized to upgrade our forms of presentation is the ICOMOS or ENAME Charter for Interpretation and Presentation of Cultural Heritage. I've given here the table with 7 principles and objectives of the chart, mainly for the sake of students, but also I think that institutions should use it too for the purpose of reinterpretation of listed heritage sites, which are in much needed terms in order to amend the confusing or absent narratives about which I spoke today. And there is this questionnaire associated with the charter, which I have made available to the organizer of the workshop, to Nita, in case it is considered to be used in the fieldwork for illustration. For this case, I made the test with some of Pristina's monuments and came up with a result of only 80% of applicability of the charter principles. This is a very low figure though. And lastly, this is my last comment: interpretation of cultural heritage is vital for its protection and key for its promotion. Pristina is a very vivid city and is already in the map of the international events. We have here Ul, he can tell us more about this. In 2 years from now, we will host Manifesta. And until then, I truly hope, we've got 2 years, so I truly hope that until then we will be capable to define, protect, communicate, promote the historic center of the city to the world as part of our culture and heritage. Well, thank you very much for your patience, for your time.